Good morning. We are deep into a sermon series on Matthew chapter 5 called The Jesus Way, and we are studying the Sermon on the Mount. But can we just take a collective breath? Goodness gracious. I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like I can't find my rhythm right now. Anybody have any trouble just figuring out what day of the week it was this week? 3 weeks ago, Janice and I, we were in Maine. We were up there to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary, and we had to stay longer than we had planned because of Hurricane Helene. And then 2 weeks ago, we were in Phoenix with our ministry staff for the Spire Conference. And then last week was pretty brutal. Not only the fear and anxiety I know so many of you felt heading into Hurricane Milton, but now finding our way forward yet again. And for those of you, and I know there are a number of you who flooded, I am so sorry. I know some of you had already ripped out and even replaced all your flooring from Helene only to see it all ruined again. And you're probably just trying to decide, do I even fix it right now? Like, what do we do next? Some of you just got back into your homes from Hurricane Ian, and now you're out again. We even have people who weren't yet back into their homes from Ian. And now, who knows how much longer it will be. And I just want to say, if that is you, our hearts hurt with you today. It's been so crazy, I think, for all of us, but obviously for some more than others. For weeks now, I've been following all the well-known weathermen on the local news stations and as well as the social media pages. And what's crazy to me is how all of them, they share the same maps and they share the same models and they report the same forecasts and they predict the weather. But some of the guys use more dramatic, more incendiary words as they share and they report and they predict the weather. And they're all saying the same thing, but they use different words for different reasons. Some use their words to bring calm and peace, and others use their words to heighten the tension. And some might say they heighten the tension because they have sponsors and they know tension increase clicks and clicks increase money, but they'd probably say they're trying to scare people into making the right decisions. But if you're trying to bring calm and peace, words matter. And if you're trying to heighten the tension to bring awareness, words matter. Now, I don't know if I will ever forget the words the Charlotte County Sheriff offered in his press conference before Milton made landfall. I don't know if you saw this, but they were provocative words. To those who are considering not following the mandatory evacuation orders in zones A and B, he said this. He said, if you are refusing to evacuate, make sure you write your name and your next of kin on your arm with a marker. When he said that, my mind was blown. I was like, this is serious. And I knew it was serious, but when he said that, I was like, man, if that doesn't get people to evacuate, I'm not sure what will. Those were carefully chosen words, and I think they probably accomplished his intended purpose to get people to evacuate, to save people's lives. You see, the words we use, whether we're speaking or whether we are listening, the words we use really do matter. And words can even mean life and death in dangerous contexts. And that's why I've entitled today's message, Words Matter, and Your Word Matters. My dad shared a lot of wisdom with me as I was growing up. He had lots of life experience. He lived through a lot of things. He learned a lot of difficult life lessons. As some would say, he graduated from the school of hard knocks. And he came up with a bunch of one-liners to communicate his wisdom with me and my siblings as we were growing up. And he'd share his one-liners over and over and over and over in hopes that we would remember them and take them to heart in our lives. For instance, whenever he was talking about difficult situations or difficult life experiences, he'd always say, experience is the best teacher, and other people's experience is the best kind of experience. In other words, learn from other people's mistakes instead of making your own. And he would also say this quite a bit, especially to me, and it was super relevant to this very critically minded thinker who loved to argue. He'd say this, he'd say, son, you can be right about what you say and wrong in how you say it, and you'd still be wrong. Right? Words matter. Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37, Jesus tells us that words matter. He said this, he said, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair black or white. All you need to say is simply yes or no. The older translations in English said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. And so we're in the Sermon on the Mount, and once again, Jesus employs this refrain. You've heard that it was said to people long ago. And then he quotes some of the religious laws his first century audience would have been familiar with. Now there were two different sources from which his audience would have learned the law. And one source, of course, was the law itself. Some of them had studied the Mosaic law, the Old Testament laws, and they knew what it said. Do not murder, which Jesus mentioned in Matthew 5:21, came directly from the 10 Commandments. And his audience would have known the 10 Commandments by heart. They would have known the 10 Commandments even if they were illiterate and could not read it for themselves. They would have known it. Now, the second source was from their own spiritual leaders, the Pharisees. And so when Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, but I tell you, Jesus was raising the standard of the law. Yes, he was showing the spirit behind the law. Yes, but he was also critiquing the Pharisees' interpretation of the law. He didn't say, you've read. He said, you've heard that it was said. And so as much as anything, Jesus was criticizing the spiritual leadership his audience had been getting from the Pharisees for their entire lives. Now, the question is, what were the Pharisees doing that caught this rebuke from Jesus? And the answer is, they were using words. They were using vows. They were using oaths to manipulate their people. How did they do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. And this is going to blow your mind. And this is how legalism works. And legalism is, oh, by the way, spiritually insidious always. So here's what was going on. If you simply said you were going to do something, you could always change your mind. Saying you were going to do something wasn't binding. You could always change your mind. No big deal, right? Maybe that's not going to blow your mind. We do that too, don't we? I mean, it's a free country. If I'm going to do something, if I say I'm going to do something, I'm always going to reserve the right to change my mind and not be bound by what I said. That probably doesn't blow you away. You might actually believe that too. I mean, Jesus didn't believe that, but you might. Anyway, merely saying you were going to do something wasn't binding. You could always wiggle out of it later. And the Pharisees would do that often. And so would the people under their spiritual care. For instance, maybe a wealthy widow promised a Pharisee she would make a large donation to some ministry endeavor. And to make sure she would not change her mind, the Pharisee would require her to swear to God that she'd follow through. And it was like, you swear to God, you got to do it. You can't back out. And if you don't follow through, then you are excommunicated. You are out of your spiritual community. You're done. You're gone. You're left all alone. You're out of here. And it wasn't like today where you could just go to another place down the street. You're out. And you might hear that and you might be like, well, okay, whatever. What does it matter? She's wealthy. She said she would. She should have followed through. Big deal. Her problem. Well, let's take it further. Maybe a struggling widow promised a Pharisee she'd make a financial donation to his ministry, and then something came up, someone died, she ended up in a much worse financial situation, she could not follow through, she'd go to the Pharisee, she'd explain her situation, and he'd say, wow, yeah, that's tough, but sorry, you swore to God. I wish I could help you, but I can't. You know the rules. You made the promise. You have to follow through or you're out. Ugh. Little more compassion there, right? And so the Pharisees, they would insist, well, it's the law, or at least it's the Pharisaic interpretation of the law. And you swore to God, so you got to follow through. And if you don't, you're out. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. No compassion, no space for grace, no wiggle room. Now that sounds a little bit worse, right? Well, buckle up. We're not done yet. Here's where it's going to blow the steam out your ears. The Pharisees might take that oath from the widow, and in order to get that oath in the first place, they might make an oath themselves. If you promise to give me this much, then I promise to do X, Y, Z with your gift. And so the Pharisees, they would require the widow to swear to God that she give the donation, but then in response, he'd say, and I swear by the temple of God. And I swear by heaven and earth, which God created to use your gift in a certain way, and it sounded really good, and it sounded really spiritual, and it sounded really dramatic and passionate and convincing, but it wasn't binding according to their interpretation of the law because they didn't swear directly to God. I'm not making this stuff up. You see, the Mishnah, which was a rabbinical interpretation of the Mosaic law, identified which oath formulas were binding and which were not. And the Pharisees knew which ones were and which ones weren't, and they'd use the binding oaths on their people and the non-binding oaths on themselves so they could wiggle their way out of their commitments and their promises while everyone else could not. You see, as long as they were crossing their fingers behind their backs when they made their promises, whatever they said didn't count. In their minds, they were not guilty of lying because they had their fingers crossed, so to speak. Well, they were still guilty of lying. And now they're also guilty of manipulation and coercion and spiritual abuse and oppression. And Jesus wasn't having it. And his general audience was like, well, okay, Jesus is telling us to keep our word. But the Pharisees in the audience, they knew darn well that Jesus was calling them out for their oppressive spiritual leadership. And he does that a lot in the Sermon on the Mount, if you know what you're looking for. Again, you've heard that it was said to people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Words matter. And your word matters. And just a little side note here, and this also helps us better understand the Sermon on the Mount and the other teachings of Jesus. And the side note is Jesus uses a lot of hyperbole here and elsewhere. Jesus isn't actually saying it's sinful to take an oath. He's not saying it's sinful to make a vow. In fact, in Matthew chapter 26, at his trial, Jesus answers the high priest under oath. It's not sinful to take an oath. Jesus is using hyperbole. Just like when Jesus said, and Pastor Gary talked about this last week, he said, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. In Matthew 5:29, he was using hyperbole. I mean, if you gouged out your right eye, you'd still use your left eye to sin. It's hyperbole. Jesus is not saying oaths are always wrong. It's not always wrong to take a vow, right? For better or for worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as God is my witness, till death do us part. It's not wrong to take an oath. It's wrong to break an oath. And Jesus said we'd be better off if we just let our yes be yes and our no be no, and anything else, lying, breaking oaths, quitting on commitments, comes from the evil one whom Jesus identified in John 8:44 as the father of lies. Years ago, this is just a few years after we started our church in the Chicago suburbs, I was getting some complaints from some of our people who felt that our ministry staff was standing them up sometimes or lying to them outright, and it was causing some trouble, and I really didn't know what to do about it because, I mean, we had this young staff in those days, but they were honest, and they had integrity, and they were trustworthy, and they were reliable. From my perspective, they were dependable, and so I started getting these complaints, and I was confused, and so I went to one of them, and I said, hey, I got an email from so-and-so who said they invited you to their party and that you said you would go, but then you didn't show up and it hurt their feelings. Like, what happened with that? And the staff member said, well, I never said I would go. And I went to another staff member and said, hey, so-and-so pulled me aside last Sunday. She said she invited you to her daughter's music recital and you said you'd go, but you never showed up and it hurt their daughter's feelings. And the staff member said, really? I never committed to going to that. And this happened on and off for probably a year before I realized what was going on. It was long enough, in fact, that we had lost a few families in our church over it who felt they were being lied to. They felt they were being let down. But then as I watched and as I just kind of realized what was happening after really paying attention, what was going on is that my staff members got into a habit of saying maybe. Maybe. Not yes, not no, but maybe. Hey, we're having our parents over for dinner on Friday night. We'd love for you to come and eat with us and meet our parents. Maybe. And they didn't want to say no directly because that might hurt the person's feelings, or maybe they didn't want to commit in the moment, FOMO and all that. And so they'd say maybe to give them the wiggle room to not show up if they didn't feel like it. And what I learned was this. When a minister says maybe, what he or she means is probably not. And when a church member hears maybe, what he or she hears is probably so. And it caused confusion, and it hurt our integrity with our people. And so we came up with a staff rule. And I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I think it was kind of genius. You've probably never heard of this rule before. Totally innovative, totally cutting edge. You're going to be so impressed. Here's the rule. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. We literally made that a staff rule. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. I mean, that's what Jesus said in Matthew 5:37. All you need to say is simply yes or no. How many of you think that's a good rule? Say, hey, we're just trying to be like Jesus. You know, as Christ's followers, we are called to be the salt of the earth. But when we fail to follow through on what we say we're going to do, it spoils our salt a little bit. And we're called to be the light of the world. But when we cross our fingers behind our backs or change our mind, whimsically or not, it dims our light just a little bit. It does. When we let unwholesome talk come from our mouths, which the Apostle Paul says not to in Ephesians 4:29, or when we talk bad about the people around us, which Jesus says not to in Matthew 5:22, it wears out our witness. Words matter. And your word matters. Our big idea for this whole sermon series has hopefully been simple and memorable for you. The Jesus way of life is the only way of life that can change the way of life on planet Earth. And the Jesus way of life says words matter. The Jesus way of life says your word matters. The Jesus way says do not let unwholesome talk come from your mouth. The Jesus way says don't slander people or you're in danger of the fires of hell. The Jesus way says don't curse your enemies, but pray for them. That's the Jesus way when it comes to words. And the Jesus way of life is the only way of life that can change the way of life on planet Earth. Church, what would happen? What would happen if the Christ followers at First Christian Church of Fort Myers would simply let our yes be yes and our no be no? Even better, what would happen if we, the Church of Jesus Christ in America today, would simply let our yes be yes and our no be no? In a world that seems like everyone has an angle, where everyone is looking for a little wiggle room, where everyone's trying to hedge their bets when it comes to their words, in a world where you can't trust anything, in a world where you can't trust the news media and you can't trust social media, you can't trust politicians or pundits, you can't even trust the videos you see anymore because they can all be deep faked. And in a world of fake news and conspiracy theories, when they're promoted like gospel truth, what if the followers of Jesus offered the world something different? Honesty, authenticity, clarity, an unambiguous commitment to speaking only what we know is true. In a world where nothing seems to be believable anymore, what if the followers of Jesus, the salt of the earth and the light of the world, what if we were believable? What if we were reliable? What if we could be trusted when we tell them that God is real? When we tell them that God is love? When we tell them that God wants to save them, not condemn them? When we tell them the Jesus way of life is the best way of life, what if we were believable? Words matter. And your word matters. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else comes from the evil one. Let's pray. God, we love you and we know that you love us. And we confess to you that we are not often enough a people of your word. And we confess to you that we are not often a people enough of our own word. May Psalm 19:14 be our prayer today, that the words of our mouths and the thoughts of our hearts would be pleasing to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.